Thank you for joining us today for Crisis Averted, How to Quickly Recover from a Salesforce Data Debacle. I'm Lori WITZEL. I'm your host for today's webinar, and I am very pleased to have Jeremy Whittington, CTO of both Thinkaholics, a Salesforce consultancy, and of Good Standing, a stealth mode startup, with us as our guest expert today and also as my presentation coach. If you don't yet know Jeremy, you should. Thinkaholics has provided advice and guidance on Salesforce implementations and architecture for a variety of organizations. They include Intel and Cars.com. And of course, this is me. So I love my job at Spanning. I have to tell you, one of the most important things I can do is to listen and learn from Salesforce experts like Jeremy and Salesforce admins, developers, and business analysts like you on the call. I present at user groups around the country, and I also manage an annual State of the Salesforce admin survey in the success community, and I'm delighted to be here. Today, we're having an informal discussion with Jeremy on 5 common Salesforce data debacles, the native tools Salesforce provides to help you recover from those debacles, and why Salesforce recommends third-party backup. So, who is responsible for protecting your Salesforce data? Guess what? It's not just Salesforce. Unfortunately, many organizations report significant data loss incidents. This is a commonality. We see this with SaaS applications and the increasing adoption of the cloud. There's a lot of research out there about this. On top of that, in my interviews with other MVPs, Salesforce admins, and business analysts, I hear it's not a matter of if, but when some kind of massive oops will occur. So, Jeremy, with the advent of cloud and software as a service, has something changed? Why would an admin need to care about data protection? Why would IT not be the people that handle that?
So, for me, Lori, when I caught your presentation on this several presentations ago, the slide you guys are seeing right now was a real eye-opener for me. Companies that I worked with that have done on-premise, I've been doing this for 17 years, so, being in an IT environments where you've got your IT group, managing every aspect of all your applications, making sure they're all backed up, they can recover, they're, distributed on servers, all of that stuff. IT was handling that for you when it was all on-premise, and as we have seen evolutions in the technology, from infrastructure as a service to platform as a service to, things like Salesforce as a SaaS application, what we have seen as IT's responsibility has, they've played less and less of a role. So, what we are seeing here is companies that are, moving into things like Salesforce, and IT is taking a back seat to, a lot of what Salesforce is doing for you, and that's why, you pay for it. One of the pieces that's getting lost here is around making sure that not only the data that's in Salesforce is, able to be restored if something happens, but also, the actual changes and configuration you've made. Overall, what was the eye-opener for me was understanding, this evolution and what Salesforce does and doesn't do, and that's what we're going to be talking about here.
Oh, that's awesome. That was a really, really good overview, Jeremy, and thank you for confirming the power of a good infographic.
Yeah.
So when we talk about this shared responsibility for data in this new SaaS-enabled world, I think you and I have had a lot of conversations about, so yeah, the provider is still responsible for elements of data protection. They're responsible for their data centers, for their redundancy, for making sure that they can recover quickly from natural disasters or power outages. These are the kinds of things you'll see in SaaS SLAs or agreements with vendors. But guess what? The responsibility is now shared, and the application owner is now responsible for human errors, for programmatic errors, to manage data protection in the face of malicious insiders, external hackers, even dealing with things like viruses and malware. Vendors like Salesforce protect your place in the cloud against failure, but they can't protect you from you. If you're an authorized user, Salesforce and other SaaS vendors must do what you tell them to do with the data. They have no way of knowing whether your request was legitimate or not. They have no way of knowing whether you're about to overwrite 500,000 records with data in error is a mistake or something that you really need to do. So SaaS application owners are now responsible for protecting their data and customizations. And it's not just people like Spanning that say that. Salesforce agrees. You will find a number of articles in their knowledge base about the importance of their customers backing up data. You own the responsibility for being able to restore. So, Jeremy, am I correct when Salesforce says locally, they just simply mean someplace other than Salesforce in your estimation?
Yeah, for sure. In terms of, what the point they're trying to make is that you just need to be making sure you are backing it up to your data and your configuration to someplace other than Salesforce.
Yep, the basic IT best practice, but since IT has now been removed from a lot of that responsibility chain, it's something that we find Salesforce BAs and admins and even developers may not be thinking about. You own the responsibility for being able to restore. So let's now move on and take a look at the meat of what we've come here to do. Let's look at some of the common data loss scenarios. These are things that I've heard from research calls when I've talked to BAs and admins and developers, and I know Jeremy's had a lot of experience as a consultant dealing with these scenarios. This one, the data loader oops trauma, is something I hear frequently at user groups. It is easy to make a mistake. Mistakes can overwrite huge amounts of data. Jeremy, tell us stories about some of the things you've seen and dealt with on a data loader oops trauma where you've had to help clients recover.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a variety of things that I've seen, doing consulting with companies for Salesforce. Just from having to go in and try to help them recover from a bad data loader that they've done internally to, probably the first, first data load I ever did in Salesforce. We were actually loading about 18 million records. We got about halfway through and we realized that Excel had messed with some of our records that we were loading. So, we were able to recover because we had taken the manual steps to be able to recover from that, but there was a whole lot of manual stuff that had to occur to get our data back and then start over, the big load. So, with the data loader, as the bullets kind of talk about here, definitely easy to make a mistake when you're loading the data in, and if you do, you just need to make sure that you can be able to get the data back if you make a mistake.
Yep, because this sounds like it could be the worst day ever for an admin. Yeah, it's when I do a user group presentation and I hear these stories, it turns into a group therapy session very quickly. All right, let's take a look at another common scenario. I've heard stories about problems from using collaboration and productivity tools, things like Microsoft Outlook plugins, from using marketing automation tools like Pardot or Marketo, or even simple sync errors, both between work groups and application syncs. So Jeremy, do me and the audience a favor and tell us some stories about things you have seen and what horrors await with these kinds of issues.
So probably one that a lot of people may be familiar with that are on the call is the Outlook connector for Salesforce. So, we've seen with clients a lot that especially when they've done like self-implementations of the Outlook connector, that you'd see either the contacts getting synced incorrectly, or a bunch of bad data comes in, or maybe things got removed, stuff like that. So that's a pretty common one. I've definitely seen with things like integrations being built. We just happen to map to the wrong field or something to that effect. You could have these tools load in incorrect data. A lot of the app exchange things, right? They play with the data that's in Salesforce, right? So you install a new app exchange product, and it goes in and reformats some stuff that you didn't want it to do. So, definitely things to be aware of whenever you're either doing integrations into Salesforce, in and out of Salesforce, or installing tools like app exchange tools or the Outlook connector.
Yeah, one of the other side horror notes about this type of scenario, it happens at compute speed, and it can impact downstream places that data Salesforce feeds data out to. So by the time you realize something has gone awry, thousands and thousands and thousands of records have been affected, and things are still running automatically before you can get in front of them. I remember that from my days as an admin, dealing with marketing automation tools. That was always fun. So let's talk about users. So users never make mistakes. Accidental end-user overwrites and deletions. Jeremy, when I talk to admins, some admins tell me about issues from users doing accidental things. Some admins assure me, no, everything is locked down. We don't have an end user who can do anything bad at all. Is there a problem with a user accidentally overwriting data? Are there scenarios out there that even the most locked down system really can't address?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, to your point, right, you can do quite a bit in Salesforce to make sure they can't do things like remove their ability to delete a record, right, or make fields read-only, right? But at the end of the day, you have to actually give them access to something, otherwise, why are they there? So,
right.
The things that they have access to, including, deleting like a record that has child records, right? That could do cascade deletes, or even them just editing fields. Like maybe they accidentally edited and removed the phone number, right? How do you get that back? How do you go back to a previous version of the data itself that they actually have access to? So, even with the best intentions of locking everything down, there definitely is the ability for people to mess things up. And, I've worked with clients who, through, especially, what we talked about before, the Salesforce Outlook connector, or just in general, them accidentally deleting the wrong records, things like that can happen. So something to point out here too is that, Salesforce does have the recycle bin for deletes, right? But, as Lori pointed out here, if the recycle bin's full, then you could get data loss from deleting records. And then another thing to think about is that the recycle bin and Salesforce mechanisms don't exactly have a way to help you if they've edited an actual field, right? If you don't have field history tracking on and they've edited something, unless there was a previous copy of that record, the data is gone. So that's what we are really talking about here when we talk about accidental changes.
Yep, and I've heard from admins it's not always obvious as to what exactly was lost, and hunting through the recycle bin, you might find parent records, you may not notice the associated child records. it apparently is quite the treasure hunt for people.
Yeah, very true.
All right. Well, let's extend from the well-meaning and well-intentioned person who has an accident and then someone who is out to get you. So, malicious data loss. One of the stories I've heard would be a salesperson who believed they might be let go and who went in and thoroughly overwrote most of their key account data and made sure all the phone numbers were wrong before they were shown out, and no one noticed what was wrong until the territory was reassigned. So again, admins who say my users can't delete anything unless I let them, a rogue user is not going to be a problem. Jeremy, tell us about the level of accuracy about how much you can lock down and prevent a data debacle caused by a rogue user.
So, I mean, we kind of talked about it on the previous slide, right? Like, there are definitely things that you can do to lock out their ability to do things, but if they've got access to do something, whether it's edit records, delete records, you know, they definitely have the ability to impact this. So, you know, even a great way to look at this too is even if you lock out deletes, but they have access to edit, they could go in and basically edit the records and just remove information, you know, like their names and phone numbers and contact information and things like that. Or, you know, if they do have the ability to delete, which hopefully I'm not scaring you guys away from removing deletes off of everything, but you know, if they do have the ability to delete, they could go in, delete records, and empty their recycle bin. So, you know, as much as we'd like to hope that this wouldn't be a problem, it's definitely something that everybody should be thinking about and make sure that if it ever occurred, that they could recover from it.
Yeah, and for the listening audience, there are some legal cases on the books about who has the responsibility for preserving Salesforce data in the case of a wrongful termination lawsuit or other HR and legal issues. Feel free to reach out to us post-presentation. I'll be happy to send you links to a couple of those articles. All right. Configuration and deployment changes. Now, Jeremy, this is something that you will have a lot more depth of knowledge in than I will. So talk to us about what can happen when you're doing configuration or deployment changes that can lead to data loss.
Yeah, so you know, starting with the first one, config changes. You know, I've worked with several customers who don't have a process in place on config changes. So rather than having all their changes be done in a sandbox and fully tested, you know, and then deployed to production, you know, I have customers who definitely go in and edit directly into production, as well as, you know, I've been on projects where, you know, we didn't see something in the config and deployment that we were building in the sandbox, and it got pushed out to production. You know, so in both situations, whether you're editing, you know, the configuration in production or you make a deployment with, you know, something from a sandbox, you know, you really need to have a way to recover from those types of oopses. Another great example of this too that isn't as apparent is, you know, I've seen where we've made a deployment to a workflow and it was, you know, updating the wrong field and it wasn't noticed for a few days, right? So, you know, being able to not only roll back the workflow rule that was deployed, but also the data, you know, that was lost essentially is important. So, you know, having the ability to get your config and data back is a part of this.
Oh my goodness. Another really, really bad day for a senior admin.
Yeah.
So in a nutshell, now that we've gone and scared ourselves silly, the takeaway in my estimation is plan ahead. So planning, of course, makes a crisis much less an event. And it's important to understand what Salesforce provides, what's natively available, and where the gaps are so you can fill them. We're going to take a look through some tools now that Salesforce provides, their native solutions to help prevent data loss. So the first tool should be familiar to most people in the audience, and if you're not using the weekly export, it's something Salesforce provides for free. We'd highly recommend that you use this as part of your backup and restore planning. Jeremy, can you talk a little bit for us about how this works and some of the ways that it can be a little bit of a manual process?
Sure. So Salesforce, for helping you with backup and restore, what it provides is the weekly export. And essentially what you have to do is you've got to log in to Salesforce and go to the backup area for the weekly export. And you can choose what it is you're going to back up, and basically what you do is you end up downloading an Excel file in CSV format. And it pulls all of the data that you've selected out of Salesforce, but it's essentially something that they prepare for you once a week, and you have to go in and download the files, and they only keep them around for so long. I don't remember the exact time frame off the top of my head, but they only keep these exports for you for so long. So it's definitely
48
something.
hours.
Okay, there you go. So it's definitely something you have to get in there and get downloaded locally, right? This is a manual thing that you have to do. And then to leverage this, as a restore capability, right? So backup and restore, you basically have a zip file of the CSVs. You'd have to go into it and figure out where the data is in those CSVs that you need to reload. You'd need to prep those files for loading back in with something like Data Loader or Informatica, things like that. Do the mappings and then do the actual restores. And something we'll talk about a little bit later is how you use Data Loader to do those restores. You really have to have a plan to get that stuff back in. So we'll go more into that later.
Okay.
Something to mention is that this does not cover your metadata, right? So you've got your data, your actual records, and then metadata, for those of you who don't know, is basically the Salesforce configuration. Any fields you've made, visual force pages you've created, all of that, the weekly export doesn't actually help you with, so you have to deal with that separately.
One other thing I might add, I don't think that the weekly export is available for SANDBOX. Am I correct on that?
I believe that's correct, yes.
All right. Well, speaking of our friend Data Loader, let's talk a little bit about the process that you started to describe for us about hunting through the export. There's apparently a great degree of care that you have to take when you're loading things back in.
Sure. So, let's say that you have the weekly exports and you've got some data you want to get back in. One of the tools that Salesforce provides for free is Data Loader. And essentially how it works is you have to load in the records one object at a time. So you would load in your account records, then your contacts, then your opportunities, and you basically have to do one load at a time. You have to essentially, before you're loading this, you really need to make sure that you're planning out the loads that you're going to do. So for example, you can't load the contacts unless you load the accounts first, right? You can't load the opportunity line items until you load the opportunity and then the contact and then the account. So you got to come up with a plan to get the data back in, right? you have to prep the files that you're going to be loading, make sure it has just the records that you actually want to load, and you have to do the mappings. And if you did something where you exported the data out of the weekly export, the mapping's pretty simple process, but if for any reason you needed to change it, you have to go through each individual field and remap everything. And then, as I said, you got to go through each load one at a time, and it can be a pretty time-consuming process. If you make a mistake, right, you've got to make sure that you've backed up the data prior to doing a data load, right? So let's say you want to restore some records. Before you even do that, you really need to make a backup of everything too, in case what you're overriding messes even more things up. So, it's a tool that is free. It's a tool that gets the job done for sure. We use it all the time with all the customers that we work with, but it's definitely something that isn't just a point and click kind of thing. It takes some effort to accomplish.
So in a nutshell, it sounds like Salesforce is doing good at providing free tools people can use to recover with, but they all do take some manual work. I tell you, one of the stories I have heard is when you're supporting a sales organization and something happens and there's data loss and it's the end of a quarter, how patient is the VP of sales going to be when you tell them it's going to take a few days until you can get their data back in shape for reporting at the end of the quarter? I would not want to be in that position. Yeah,
and that's accurate. I mean, some loads are quick, and other loads take more planning. And if you mess up a load, then it takes even more time. So it can easily take a day or two to get stuff back in properly.
All right, now that we've scared ourselves further, let's go on and take a look at other tools that Salesforce provides. So Jeremy, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about Ant.
Sure. So Data Loader, what we just talked about, is a tool that you can leverage for loading and exporting and restoring data in Salesforce. The Force.com migration tool could be used for backing up and restoring the actual the metadata, the configuration side. So this is, again, another free tool that Salesforce gives you guys that essentially is a command line tool that you can use to, say, just back up all of the objects, all of the Visualforce pages, right? You just say, I want to back everything up. And then, if, for example, you had messed up something in a deployment that you did, and you have a backup of what's in production, you could leverage this to say, okay, I'm going to go in, I'm going to build a package of what was messed up, or maybe even restore everything if that's the easiest way. But you build a package file of all the things you need to restore, and you can execute it via command line to put the stuff back in. So, definitely a good way to get the configuration in and out in a repeatable manner, right? Which is important.
Yes.
But again, it is a manual process. It requires, someone of a developer caliber to look at the config file, build the package, execute the load. So this is not a admin style point and click type tool.
Yep, not a button-click admin fit, huh?
Yeah, not at all. But powerful.
All right. And with great power comes great responsibility.
Very true.
So let's talk about some things we heard when we presented to Salesforce developers. Folks use code repositories like Git. They use the SANDBOX. Talk to me a little bit and talk to our audience about the role these may play in ensuring that you've got metadata and data protection.
Sure. So starting off with, code repositories, if any of you are developers, I'm sure you've run into the headache of Salesforce does not make it easy to do source control, right? For a variety of reasons. One is that your developers are not developing locally; they're all developing within the sandbox itself, right? So having those changes all in source control can be a little tedious. Things like the Force.com IDE, or some people are using Maven's Mate and stuff like that, has capabilities of leveraging something like Git, but it's definitely not a just very easy point and click process. And with code repositories and trying to restore something that's messed up, you have to go through the same process as you would if you did a backup prior to, right? You've got to figure out what it is you're going to restore, make a config or a package, and use something like the Force.com migration tool to get it all back in. So the other side of this is, and really what I see is what most people do, and that is they use their sandboxes for their backup of code. And some of the challenges around leveraging sandboxes is that there are limits to how often you can refresh them. They can easily get out of sync. So I actually this morning went to make a deployment to production and found out that for a client, and found out that changes have been made in production and the sandbox was out of sync. So being able to get my code out means that it's going to take us a few more days, right, to get the sandbox back in sync. So just as something you can use to make sure your code is, your metadata is backed up, Git or code repositories are a great thing to look at, and sandboxes are a great thing to look at, but they also have challenges in using them.
Yep, that manual intervention and that sync issue is always interesting. So we've got other things that I've heard when I've interviewed people. I've heard that people actually use reports in Salesforce as a way to back up data that they consider important. And they're also using change sets to manage the building of packages. So Jeremy, I'm going to defer to your expertise. Can you add a little color around these two ways to deal with data protection issues?
Sure. So one of the challenges with the weekly export, and I don't think we actually mentioned this and should have, is that it's weekly, right? So getting that data out of Salesforce through an admin point and clicky way, you're only getting your data once a week. So reports are something you could leverage to get data more often. Again, this is a manual step that you've got to do to get data out, but it is something you could leverage. Some of the challenges around using reports, aside from it's a very manual process, is that it can only export, so much data at a time, right? So you can only get like 256 columns, you only get 65,000 rows of data. Depending on how the report is built, it may not be one-to-one on the objects, right? You may be doing a summary report that gets data from 3 different objects. So if you go to load that stuff back in with Data Loader, you've then really got to modify those files to leverage. So it's something that you can certainly do to back your stuff up, especially in a pinch, but it's a pretty tedious thing to leverage. So change sets, so reports was for data, right? Change sets are something that you can leverage to, be backing up configuration. So if you created stuff in production and wanted to archive it off, you could either refresh the sandbox, or you can use a change set to do incremental refreshes of the stuff, and that can go either direction.
So, yep, Salesforce provides lots of things, and again, they all take a little bit of time and thought and care to knit together. There is one other thing that Salesforce does provide. They provide what they call the data recovery service. So this is what they refer to as sort of the last-ditch recovery. If you have tried everything, and you cannot get lost data back, and you need it. What I've learned from the knowledge base and from my contacts at Salesforce, hey, it only goes back 90 days for production, 30 days for SANDBOX. If you have data that was lost at day 91, it's not going to be in their storage. It's data only. It doesn't include metadata or customizations. It takes 4 weeks or more until it's completed. We have read on their website, on the knowledge base, it's a $10,000 fee for the service. All data is returned in CSV format, and so like a weekly export, you're going to need to hunt for what to restore and then do a manual restore process. Jeremy, do you know anyone who's actually had to use the data recovery service? I've heard a couple of people who have.
I have not worked with anyone directly that has, opted for this option, just because it is pretty painful. Yeah. But I've worked with various clients that when I explain to them how this works, it gets their attention. So, for me, again, when I caught the very first presentation I saw you do, Lori, this was huge for me. This is pretty much the gotcha moment that I think most executives have at a company when they're expecting Salesforce to do everything for them, and they realize that it's not as easy as that. So, with the data recovery service, well, with Salesforce in general, the slide that we had earlier, it talks about what it is they're responsible for and what it is that they help you with, right? If they have a hardware failure, no problem. They've got the backups to get the server, they've got the redundancy as well as the backups to make sure you don't see an interruption, and they can recover from it, right? If they've got a software failure, right, they've got ways to get this stuff back and get it back into your org. But this is ultimately for them making a mistake, right? So if you've got a problem that you need to recover from, Salesforce ultimately, what we saw in the beginning is that they recommend that you get a different solution for backup and restore. And as you pointed out, Lori, as a last-ditch effort, you can go to them to get your data back, only your data. But as you can see from these bullets, it's not an easy process.
Yep, it's a definite time delay, and it's cost and expense, and then there's still manual effort at the end of it.
Yeah. So if you have even some of the legal compliancy things that you're supposed to be doing, right? This does not cover you completely.
Yep. Well, Salesforce does give you lots of options if you're an admin. All their native options do require some manual effort, though. And that, I think, is the most important takeaway for people. Basically, you're responsible. You've got to make a plan for how you're going to take care of your data, protect your data and metadata. Salesforce is there to help you to a certain extent, but it's all on you as an admin or a BA or the application owner. So Salesforce, they recommend you use a third-party backup tool you can find on the App Exchange. They actually say this in the knowledge base. They say it a couple of different places. We've gone through these Salesforce native tools, and it's interesting to me that they actually do recommend third-party backup and restore tools, and I think we can understand why. So, Jeremy, you and I both have talked about requirements, and you know that my job consists of going out to folks like you and admins and BAs and developers and trying to make sure that things that are part of a third-party backup solution here are what people really, really need. So this can be used, if people are listening in, as the first step in building a checklist for yourselves. Because I'm in product management and product marketing, I'm not in sales officially, but of course I encourage you to take a look at spanning as you go through building out your checklist. These are requirements I've heard in research calls. We need to make sure that we can automatically restore permanently deleted items, parents and children, even the grandchild items. Gee, I'm a BA, I need to make sure that I can do a rollback restore. A big bad thing happened and I want to do a pinpoint restore and roll back to the last good moment in time, just of those things that were affected. We have heard that people have tried different restore and backup tools, and the restores don't always work. So restore perfection and reliability. That capability is vital. It must not fail. Admins need transparency. They need an auditable report on activity. They need backup status reporting. You want a third-party tool that doesn't leave you guessing as to what was done. Jeremy, am I preaching to the choir here? Does this make sense to you?
Oh yeah. Using using this as a framework for what you're looking for, is definitely a good starting point. And I'm sure, especially if some of you have like legal compliancy things, you're probably already aware of these types of things. But using this as you go out to evaluate the tools that are on the App Exchange, or even if you plan to do anything manually, this is a good starting point.
Good. Well, let's take a look at more on the potential checklist. So, usability. If you're looking at a third-party tool, you want it to be easy to use. You don't want to have to spend a week learning how to use something that is vital to protecting your data and metadata. You want it to be automatic. All those manual processes associated with the native tools that Salesforce provides, you don't want to have to deal with those things. You want to let computers do what computers are good at doing, which is making things automatic and repeatable. Ideally, as part of usability, you want something that will scale, that will grow with you. No storage limits is something that's been very important to people when we do product research, and that's part of why we offer it at Spanning. We want to make sure that you can reduce the amount of things you store in Salesforce if you need to. You can use a backup tool to archive those things and control your storage. And of course, you must check for security and compliance. You might want to involve, if your organization has an InfoSec team, information security people in IT will be very interested in knowing what security certifications a third-party tool has, what kinds of data privacy protection and data sovereignty protection they have. This is especially important if you might be moving data to and from the European Union. For people who have that concern, there'll be a blog post coming out, I think, in a couple of weeks on that topic. We want to make sure that a third-party tool will align with your compliance requirements. And one last requirement, and this is something that people don't often think about top of mind, but when I was a Salesforce admin and looking at vendors, I want to know that they're going to be around in a year or two. I want them to be business stable. I feel much more secure when I know that they're backed by a stable organization. So do take a look at, is this an independent vendor? Are they funded by venture capital folks? Are they going to be here tomorrow? Are they part of an organization that's stable? So this is the part where I talk a little bit as a product marketing manager about why admins or BAs would evaluate Spanning Backup for Salesforce. We provide a lot of things on that checklist. Why? Because we talk to people like you, and we listen and learn for what you think is necessary. We're an agile shop. We develop and iterate very quickly. So if there's a particular functionality that's interesting to you and we may not have it quite yet, talk to the product team at Spanning and let's get some use cases built out. Jeremy, I know that you've worked with many different vendors. Do you have any thoughts to share about why an admin or a BA might include spanning on an evaluation process?
I mean, sure. So, some of the products I've evaluated personally, just lack a lot of these features. They help you with certain things, but they don't have all of the features that I'm looking for. Especially the way that you guys are dealing with, like, the cascade, or the parent-child relationships, and ultimately, in my opinion, just how easy it is to use your tool that's right in Salesforce, native interface inside of Salesforce. So, that's what's drawn me to spanning from a personal level.
Cool. Thank you for that feedback. So, we do point-in-time backup. We enable fast restores. We are in-app. The reason we're an app is because that way an admin can pick up the roles and permissions they've assigned if they choose to have end users do restores. And also, it's the environment admins and BAs are working in every day. So we will empower our friends in the admin and BA community on any device. We're Salesforce One ready, and we enable your end users. I know that some admins shudder at the thought of end users touching anything for restore, but if an end user has rights to do something to data that means they could make a mistake, wouldn't it be nice if they didn't crowd your doorway and say, oh my God, I just did this, can you help me fix it? Let's have you keep your focus on high-level activity in your organization and not being Salesforce IT support on demand. Jeremy, as ever, it's just a delight to get to work with you and learn from you. I'm so glad you could make the time to be here with our guests.
I definitely appreciate the opportunity to be here. This has definitely become one of my more passionate topics in the Salesforce realm. So I always enjoy talking about this now.
Well, we want to make sure that if you have a tough day at work, it's not because of data loss. Thank you again, everybody. Look forward to the next one, and take care. Be safe out there.